Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Jamie Vaught-Karasek, Collection Manager for the Department of Photography and Media and co-curator of the exhibition Strange Realities, The Symbolist Imagination, open now through January 5th in galleries 124 through 127. Tonight's lecture, held in conjunction with the exhibition and on the eve of Halloween, will examine how symbolism's mysterious imagery contributed to its popularity in turn of the century Europe. Support for this program is provided by the Allan McNab Endowed Fund. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this evening's program and my fellow curator for this exhibition, Jay Clarke. Jay is the Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. Prior to rejoining the Art Institute in 2018, she was the Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Clarke Art Institute and a lecturer of the History of Art graduate program at Williams College. Jay's many curatorial accomplishments at the Art Institute include the groundbreaking exhibition Becoming Edvard Munch, Influence, Anxiety, and Myth, Bridget Riley drawings from the Artist Studio, which traveled to the Hammer Museum and the Morgan Library and Museum, co-curating 2023's Picasso, Drawing from Life, and last year's Paula Modersohn-Becker, I Am Me. She's also contributed to and edited numerous publications, including Edvard Munch, Trembling Earth, 2023, and Picasso Encounters, 2017. Jay is widely regarded as a leading scholar on Käthe Kollwitz, Edvard Munch, Paula Modersohn-Becker, and German art from the turn of the century. She holds both a master's and PhD from Brown University. And now, please join me and welcome Jay to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was lovely. We had so much fun working on the show together. And I was curious if anyone wore a costume tonight, but I don't think anyone did. You get a door prize. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I'm so glad to have such a great crowd here tonight. This has been a really, really fun and exciting and educational exhibition to work on. So this exhibition looks really at the really begins at the last decade of the 19th century in Europe, where there was really an explosion of evocative and disturbing works of art. There's images of demons, skeletons, femmes fatales, dreams and nightmares, and these works of art were given a platform really like they never were before. So, the exhibition, Strange Realities, The Symbolist Imagination, which I hope you all have seen or will see after this or again some other time. It explores these themes from many perspectives and many different geographies as well, as you'll note, including France, Belgium, Norway, and Germany. So today, on the eve of Halloween, as Jamie said, the timing seems perfect to look at these works of psychological intensity that, for better or worse, are very relevant to our own times. So we wanted to schedule our exhibition during Halloween as the imagery is so connected. And here I'm just showing you two movie posters that are a riff on Edvard Munch's The Scream, which we're going to talk about more later. One is the horror movie Scream. Apparently there's Scream 1 through 7. I haven't even seen 1, so I got a long weekend ahead of me. And then there's Macaulay Culkin's adorable Home Alone and Edvard Munch's The Scream, which we'll get to next. And I could do an entire lecture on how symbolist imagery, specifically Munch's Scream, has percolated into contemporary popular culture, like through politics and caricature. But unlike Jimmy Kimmel, I want to keep my job. So I'm just going to move right along. So tonight we're going to look at the movement from its own really equally fraught moment in the 1880s, 90s, and across the turn of the century. And the Scream is an especially apt marker for the movement, not only because it has become so iconic today, but because in many ways it encapsulates the strange interiority of the symbolist movement. And part of the reason we wanted to put it right in the entrance to the exhibition, most people say, oh, it's because you want to draw people in. And that actually wasn't the first idea. The first was, I think most people don't know what symbolism is, even art historians who work in the field. An artist I met earlier who knows so much about the history of art, it's like, I don't know anything about symbolism. Because we thought people will come in, they'll recognize it, and they'll say, oh, that's symbolism. And they'll already have a sense of what these objects are. So first I wanted to tell you that there's many versions of the scream. So if you look at it and you say, funny, I thought it was a different color. Munch did many versions of the scream. The first one on the far left is at the National Gallery, or the National Museum of Oslo from 1893. The second one is 2 years later. It's in a private collection in the US. It's a pastel on cardboard. And you may remember this because it made a record in 2012. It was sold for $120 million at auction, which was the highest price anything sold at auction at the time. The lithograph, which is in the middle, which we're going to get into next. And then on the right is another version at the Munch Museum to around circa 1910, although there's still some debate about the dates. And yes, it's an iconic image. Yes, it's well known. It speaks to the sort of, anxiety of the era. But I think part of its popularity is also because two different versions on the far left and the far right were stolen. We've heard about the Louvre heist in the last week or so, but the first one on the left was stolen from what was then known as the National Gallery in Oslo during the Lillehammer Olympics. Someone put a ladder up to the outside of the museum, went in, stole it, and left a snarky note. The one on the far right was a little bit more dramatic. Armed robbers came in and ripped it and the Madonna off the walls of the Munch Museum. Both were obviously recovered. So I do think that's also part of the fame around it. So this is the lithographic version. The artist probably made around 20 impressions of it, which is a term we use for 20 pulls off of the stone on which it was printed that we know of. There may be more, many of them in the Munch Museum. So suffice it to say, we're very, very lucky to have this print here in Chicago, and I think some people are kind of surprised that it lives here. But there's an inscription below the image. It says Geschrei, which is German for scream, and there's an inscription in German below the image that says, I felt the great scream through nature. So the artist states it in the first person, and the phrase very much expresses Munch's feelings about the terror and the anxiety of what can be felt through the landscape. And the way it's drawn is sort of sketchy and agitated, sort of hallucinatory in a way, adds to this sense of unease. And the figure itself is not even particularly human. So I think in a way it's easy to project one's own personality onto it. It's it's like a blob. Although because Munch said, I felt the scream go through nature, many people assume that it's kind of an abstracted self-portrait. So symbolist artists like Munch really focused on their inner feelings, on literary statements, even literary statements as short as the one that we see here on this print, and the transformative power of nature on the human psyche. So today we're going to look at the various stylistic and thematic approaches to symbolism in several different European countries, because in each country it was a little bit different. And because the borders were different at the time, I thought I'd just show you a quick map of Europe. We have France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Norway. See, it says Norway, Sweden. Norway wasn't even a country yet on its own, circa 1900. And I especially want to point out Belgium to my son, who's in the audience, because he called me in Belgium in December, and he said, where are you, Mom? I said, I'm in Antwerp, Belgium. He goes, well, where's that? I am paying for his college education. So, Liam, that's Belgium. Okay, there we go. So most people know a bit about Impressionism, and we see two examples here from our amazing Impressionist collection here at the Art Institute that we're very proud of. But again, most people don't know what came immediately after Impressionism, and that was Symbolism, almost its polar opposite. So to start with Impressionism, artists like Claude Monet focus on subjects from their daily life. This is his home and garden in Argenteuil, outside of Paris. They depicted street scenes or images from modern life, such as Renoir's depiction of two jugglers at the Cirque Fernando in Paris. And this was unusual because artists were usually showing history paintings or religious paintings. So to show two girls just standing there at a circus was radical at the time. I think it's sometimes easy to forget about that. By contrast, symbolists turned their backs on reality, choosing instead to express their emotions, nightmares, dreams, and desires. And the dark and alluring works are filled with many spectral figures, enigmatic landscapes that very much confound and confuse as much as they really draw you in. And I show you two works in the exhibition. One that's been a real fan favorite is Ferdinand Knopf, who's a Belgian artist, and this is called The Veil. And here we see this veil over her head and potentially her hands up to her head, but I encourage you all to look at it because we really don't know what's going on underneath that veil. But again, this sense of sort of secrecy. And on the right is Odilon Redon, who we'll hear a bit more about, called Guardian Spirit of the Waters. And here we see this giant head with wings looking over the waters with a sailboat. And we know what we're seeing. We know this is a woman with a veil. We know this is a face with wings, but it's all made very strange. So symbolist artists shared a cynical perspective on technological advancement and the large influx of people from the country into the urban centers across the turn of the century. They believed that the rise of industry and materialism signaled a moral decline. Yet at the same time, they very much embraced scientific discourse and the discoveries being made in science. And unlike the Impressionists, who wanted to depict the physical world, symbolists used art to envision alternative realities. Some looked to the past, some looked to the future, some wanted to depict idyllic worlds, anarchist worlds, and others really just wanted to focus on the self. And we have a whole room of self-portraiture in the exhibition. So what exactly is symbolism? It's an art movement that's exceptionally difficult to define, in part because it has so many different styles and so many different subject matters. It's really, the way I like to define it best is it's the art of the idea. It's the world beyond the superficial appearance to the world of the imagination. An art of personal dreams and visions and images that are suggestive but not descriptive. And here I show you two more Odilon Redons from our collection. And the eye, which is the image that was used at the entrance of the exhibition, is kind of the all-seeing eye. And there's these two small figures in the foreground. And someone asked me yesterday, what do you think the figures are, or earlier this week? And I thought, in some ways, it's really just to give scale to this giant eyeball. In a way, we don't really know what they're doing there. And then on the right is an imaginary hybrid creature, which was one of his favorites, a large human head with bat wings. So whereas the Impressionists had a series of exhibitions in Paris that you can point to and say, all right, those are the Impressionist artists who showed in those exhibitions, symbolism was very widespread geographically throughout Europe and Scandinavia. And it flourished from the 1880s through around the time of the First World War. And symbolists worked, again, as I said, on many styles, many different subjects. And today we're going to look at the ways, again, that they sort of were a little bit different in different countries. But it started very much as a literary movement. And I think that's something that Jamie and I are realizing is perhaps better known than symbolist art, symbolist literature. And one of the artists who I think is the most easy to define as a symbolist is Redon. And Odilon Redon is a French artist who, this collection, believe it or not, the Art Institute of Chicago has over 440 works just by Redon alone. Many of them were purchased over 100 years ago from the artist's widow. And then other works were just added over the years. So we have an incredible collection. And many of his friends wrote about him, and one of them called him the Prince of Dreams. And that was the title of an absolutely stunning exhibition, one of my favorite ever, in 1994, that was curated here at the Art Institute Chicago. It was a gorgeous exhibition. But this portfolio of prints and the entire series is in the exhibition. I think that's something that's important to remember. A lot of these artists worked on paper in series, so that kind of like literary. First you look at this, then you look at that, a kind of a narrative element to it. And In Dreams was the artist's first attempt to break into the art world. So he created this portfolio of very strange images called dreams. You think dreams and nightmares. And he didn't need money at the time, so he gave them to his friends, and he gave them to art critics who he hoped would write about him. That didn't work so well, which we'll find out more about. But staying with the eyeball theme here, the artist often combined human anatomy with flowers, showing a fascination with contemporary science, specifically Darwinian evolution. And the works we see here and he often had poetic titles himself. You can see the one on the far left. There was perhaps a first vision attempted in the flower. So again, even the titles themselves are evocative and make you wonder what they actually mean. In the center, this is one of his famous images, the eye like a strange balloon moved towards infinity. We see this giant eyeball looking up towards the sky. And you have to imagine as well that hot air balloon travel was relatively new and being discussed quite often in the popular press. But, the basket where you usually see the people, like the guy in The Wizard of Oz is in the basket. Here we have a severed head. So that's typical Odilon Redon. The work on the far right, and now I've totally lost my place, which is okay, is called The Strange Flower. And so we see this woman's face on this tiny little flower stalk looking out at us. And so again, it's sort of part flower, part human, but then he adds this sort of parenthetical description at the end called Little Sisters of the Poor, which is the name of a Catholic order of nuns that were devoted to charity for the elderly. So what one has to do with the other, we don't really know. But as I mentioned, one very important influence on Redon's imagery was the scientific discourse of his time. He was immersed not only in Darwinian theory, specifically the theory of evolution, which was described in his Origins of the Species, first published in 1859, but also Darwin's followers. There's a lot of people in France who were writing after him, who's very popular in France and in Germany. Specifically, Redon's mentor, whose name is Armand Claveau, and we see an example of dissections of various flowers in the south of France. And they were actively researching microscopic plant biology, and the artists were able to see these images in their publications for the first time. We all know what these things look like now, but back then, the possibility to reproduce images from microscopically garnered specimens was really quite new. So you'll see in the exhibition some examples, sort of one-to-one examples of these journals, one called La Nature, and images that that Redon may have taken from them. These are just two more works from our collection that are connected to science. I think I mentioned that amazing exhibition Douglas Druick and Peter Zegers wrote of the work on the right called Primitive Man. It suggests that moment in human evolution, the dawn of consciousness, where even though he's nude and he's crouched in his figure outside in nature, there's sort of dawn of recognition. And his proximity to the landscape suggests a Stone Age man, which was probably related to the Cro-Magnon man, which had just been discovered in France 2 years before this work was made. So it was very, very timely. And of course, these figures call into question the sort of abhorrent consequences of evolutionary thought at the time, which would use physiognomy and phrenology, which was the study of the shape of the head, as a racist ideology that justified discrimination on racial hierarchies. That was not Redon's aim here, but I think that sort of bears mentioning. And then there's this amazing drawing on the right, which almost never comes out of the vault. I just love it. It's called The Cell. And this idea of, that they didn't know what was inside a cell at this particular time, but you have this little head, this tiny little head. And then around it are these beautifully drawn flowers, like this bouquet of flowers. Really just fascinating images. So one of the things that Redon drew very frequently early in his career were these charcoal drawings, and we call them noirs because they were made with black chalk and charcoal. And another thing, so he tried to sell these and they didn't go over well, maybe because they were so weird and someone didn't want to have an image of a nun on a beanstalk on their wall. I can't imagine why. But I think they were just, they were strange. They were very unusual. So in the 1880s, he was trying to sell them. He was very unsuccessful. His family stipend sort of started drying up, and he really needed money. And color was what was selling. So as you can see here, where's my little pointer? This is all in black and white. This started as a black and white drawing, which you can see here, and there's just color added over it. So he took these as like a base of the composition, and then he used these very bright pastels over them. And they really started selling well. And then they started selling so well that people wanted the black and white drawings. Too late now. They were drawn over. But we're lucky to have many of them here. And one really remarkable thing are the immensely powerful colors of Redon's pastels, especially these really hallucinatory blues, which you'll see in the exhibition. Shout out to Demi, my intern, who helped me with the research here. And these colors were a relatively new phenomenon at the time for artists to be using, with the introduction of aniline dyes, which are actually incredibly toxic. Maybe that explains the imagery. But these aniline dyes were mixed into these powdery pastels, these pastel sticks. And the aniline dyes are synthetic, and they're used mostly to dye fabrics or to dye furniture. But they were also used to make pastels. And they create these really vivid colors, but they're very susceptible to light. They fade quite quickly, so that's why we're so careful with showing these. And just to give you a sense of artists doing very different things in France at the same time as Redon, on the left we have Gustave Moreau, who's sort of a hometown hero because we've got a great painting by him. This is called Inspiration, and here we see a writer with a little putti whispering in her ear, inspiring her to write. And these two beautiful birds in the water, just a beautifully drawn watercolor. Anyone who's ever tried to do watercolor, you look at this and you just, shake your head. How did they do it? And on the right is Henri Martin, who likewise depicted symbolist imagery. And here we see a very diffuse image, a woman in this sort of hazy landscape. It's called Silence. And she has her hair across her mouth, and she's holding it to sort of keep that silence. But then oddly enough, she has Christ's crown of thorns on her head. So again, this very mysterious imagery. So now we're going to move to Belgium. And whereas symbolism was a bit more diffuse in many different portions of France as it emerged, although still connected really through the intercession of the art market, in Belgium, specifically Brussels, symbolism was more institutionalized via these art collectives modeled on those of the Impressionists. And one group that had a lot of acclaim was known as Les 20, the 20. And here we see the 20 artists, the vintistes, the artists who were involved in this collective, but then they often invited people. And here they invited John Singer Sargent, James McNeill Whistler, so artists from the US, from Belgium, from France, Auguste Rodin, the sculptor, all sorts of different artists who they invited to show with them. And on the right, I show you just a cover design for a poster and then, a cover design for a book. Again, Les 20, we have the 20. And one of the most important artists in the 20 his name was James Ensor. And during this time in his career, the drawing we have on the left, which is a recent gift from David and Celia Hillard to the collection, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. He made a number of large charcoal drawings that he showed at Les 20. And he had these drawings of local types on the coast of Belgium, where he was from in Ostend. And here we see a man at a table with a bottle of liquor wearing a mask. And this is the painting, the later painting that he did, at the same year. And a woman coming in with a sort of bonnet, maybe also wearing a mask, holding a kind of stick. And they say it could represent Ensor's father, who was really kind of a hopeless alcoholic and ended up dying of alcoholism, sort of staggering around town, embarrassing the family. And they say the woman could be the wife, which would make sense why she's holding a stick, or it could be Ensor's grandmother. But just a wonderful work by the artist. And he became very well known for his images of masks. And this is the very first instance where the artist uses a mask, and we have this drawing right here in Chicago. This is another painting he did called Intrigue on the right, which is very well known. And here we see the artist, he's depicting his sister, Mariette, here in this green cloak here. And they're all, this sort of the grotesquerie of the mask. Maybe it's Carnival. Maybe it's just showing the hypocrisy of society that everyone wears a mask to some extent. But one very interesting thing is the man next to her, here, is her top-hatted fiancé, Tan He-tzu, who is a Chinese art dealer from Berlin. And so the intrigue was really that in this tiny small town of Ostend, Belgium, his sister, there was sort of what was perceived as an interracial relationship, and they're all whispering. So that's the intrigue. It's really sort of a critique of hypocritical society. Now, crowds are something that you see quite often in Belgian art of this time, and this is an amazing work by Henri de Greux. We see Christ being jeered by the crowds. This is Christ. This is Pontius Pilate next to him. And the combination of the grotesque and the sort of teeming mass of humanity creates this very uncomfortable, crowded atmosphere where one feels sympathy for the tormented Christ. The opposite is true of the sort of grotesque faces and the violent nature of the crowd. Ensor also did an image of Christ, and there's a print in the exhibition, and then there's a very famous painting at the Getty Museum, which was done before, which is on the lower left. And here we see Christ entering into modern-day Brussels during a Mardi Gras parade. So it's a sort of strange combination of events. And it's very, very hard to find Christ. And so we have a blow-up here. You see him just with this tiny little halo here, but you can barely find him. And since it's the day before Halloween, it should be noted that Ensor often used skeletons. Not for Halloween purposes, sorry folks, can't make a link that direct, but also just to remind us of the transience of life. He often showed himself as a skeleton, like we're all gonna go there one day. And so we have skeletons warming themselves here. They're already dead, they don't need to warm themselves. This I just absolutely love. Two skeletons fighting over a herring. Don't even ask me what it means, it's great though. And then here we see the artist showing himself as a skeleton at his easel, making a painting. And he often depicted himself as a skeleton or as a kind of Christ-like figure, and that was quite common. Here we have self-portrait with demons tormenting me. So again, you have all these crazy, wild, elastic figures, which I encourage you, these devils and monsters surrounding him. And just a couple of years later, he used that same image for a poster for an exhibition, which we see on the far right, which we're going to talk about at the very end. This is one of my favorite works. Of course, I'm going to say that about all of them, but by an artist who's almost unknown in the US. His name is Willem de Guve-Denonck, and this is called Servants of Death. And we see a man on top of a piece of wood, a tree trunk, and then below him is another man, and they're cutting the wood. But obviously what they're cutting the wood for is for a grave, maybe their own grave. And so they're called the Servants of Death. And I think the fact that there's a sunset, the end of the day, the end of life, and then over here, there's a fire that's being extinguished. So again, sort of the transience of life. Now for something really weird. Another branch of Belgian artists that grew out of Ensor and de Guve-Denonck were called the art idealiste, so idealist art. And their leader was named Jean Delville, who made the poster on the left for an exhibition who made all of these works. And the art idealiste sought to promote an idealistic spiritual art that, again, like the other symbolists, rejected realism, and they wanted to really go for the pure idea. They were very, very philosophical. And so here we have the idol of perversity, and then this other figure called Misteriosa, who some people have identified. And one of my colleagues said, "Don't you think that's an album cover somewhere?" And it must be. I don't know where, but it's perfect for an album cover. And here's our cover girl, Medusa. Now, Medusa, as many of you know, is a figure from Greek mythology, often described as having venomous snakes for hair. And if you look at her, you turn to stone, which you can kind of see through these creepy eyes of hers. But at Delville's drawing, her hypnotic stare comes out from a web of liquids. And you see the snakes are dipping their heads into this liquid, which is oddly blue, like a blue ink, drinking from it. And then there's these poppies, which are smoking in the foreground, which we were thinking probably connects to opium. And there's this strange veil over her face. But it's just absolutely beautifully drawn. And one thing I find quite interesting, which I gave a whole talk on, which you definitely do not want to hear, is that he used colored pencils for most of this. And you think, isn't that such a modern thing? It was developed not that long before then. So these very, very specific way of drawing. So there was, not surprisingly, a strong veil of misogyny running through many of the symbolist artists. And one artist who had very sort of grotesque but also fascinating images of women was Félicien Rops. And there's one in the show called The Greatest Love of Don Juan, which I'm not going to get into too, it's complicated. But this is probably his best-known image, Pornocrates, this woman who's blind, she's probably a prostitute, and she's leading a pig who sort of symbolizes male desire, like who controls whom is the question. And then another work called Modern Masks. So moving on to Germany, every country kind of had its own brand and its own name, not brand really, but of symbolism. And in Germany, it was called neo-romanticism. So this idea of reviving a romantic past. And this is a very famous image on the far left by a German romantic artist whose name is Caspar David Friedrich. There was a gorgeous show at the Met earlier this year on his work. And that's what the artist on the right, Max Klinger, is really trying to emulate in a way. So here we had this image called Abandoned, which is a young woman who sort of, is crouching down at the seashore like Friedrich is. And then this is called Night. And we see the artist staring out at the water, looking at a lily, and it's actually a self-portrait. It's a portrait of the artist, Max Klinger, as well. This is quite a wonderful work in the exhibition. So the Isle of the Dead, the painting on the right, was one of the most famous images at the end of the 19th century in Germany. And like the Scream, like many artists, people think, there's only one of them. There's 4 or 5 of the Isle of the Dead. Trust me, when artists got a good thing, they made some repetitions. And the writer Vladimir Nabokov said that reproductions, like photographic reproductions of the Isle of the Dead, could be seen in nearly every Berlin household around 1900. And one gauge of the power can be seen that people who admired the work, none other than Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis, had a copy of it in his office. Sergei Rachmaninoff created a symphony called The Isle of the Dead in 1909. And Adolf Hitler bought a version of the painting in 1933, the year he came to power. And I think part of the reason that a lot of these artists aren't known is because people say, it reminds me, of the Third Reich. These artists had nothing to do with it, but it's just interesting to see how powerful in good and very disturbing ways these images were. So Max Klinger, the artist on the left, was a huge fan of Arnold Böcklin. And Böcklin's dealer, Fritz Gerlitz, this painting is really popular. Let's make some reproductive prints after it that we can sell. And so Klinger made an etching after it. Now, since I have to make fun of all my family members, this is my brother Charlie's favorite, and he's here. This is called Klinger's A Glove, and this is this amazing series. Once you see it, hopefully it won't leave your mind because it's so incredible, where it's along one wall, all 10 of these prints. So here, the woman drops her glove, and it's sort of this pre-cinematic sway, strange swaying of figures. And the man, who's actually a portrait of the artist himself, drops down to pick it up. And he has all of these crazy fantasies, sexual fantasies, dream fantasies, all sorts of imaginary scenes with the glove. So the glove takes on its own persona. So here we see the artist having a nightmare. And there's a giant glove behind him. There's gloves coming in from the side, trying to get him. I think I have bad nightmares. And you can't really see it, but there's the snout of a little animal here that you can barely see. And then he comes to life in Abduction. And this crazy pterodactyl-type creature takes the glove and flies out a window with these beautiful, I think they're lilies below them. So it's kind of like he's come out of the nightmare. The person is, throwing their arms out the window to try to get the glove back. But the interesting thing is Klinger was very interested in Darwinian evolution, and he was very interested in scientific discovery, and animals like pterodactyls fossils were being uncovered and depicted for the first time. And here we see a drawing that Klinger did when he was 17 or 18 years old called Darwinian Theory. And it's sort of puzzled-looking Darwin talking to some apes who's holding a baby. But another print in our collection is called Pursued Centaur. So here we see the centaur is running away from the people chasing it, but ultimately man, who is the more highly developed being, is going to win because he's riding a horse and he has intelligence, or so that's the idea. Now, it's fairly rare for women to become symbolist artists. This is a Austrian-German artist named Médise Pelikan, and there's a portrait of her on the left. In part, it was not seen acceptable for women to become artists to begin with. It was very much frowned upon. It was difficult for them to get an education. They were not allowed into any state academy, so they had to go to a private education, which usually cost 5 or 6 times as much as the regular education available to a male artist. And most importantly, they were not supposed to think. And symbolism is a very sort of intellectual, emotive kind of art. And they were supposed to show like pretty images of babies or flowers. So this artist was quite different. And this is a beautiful work of art that we just bought earlier this year called Larch Forest by a Full Moon. It's a pastel drawing. And I think it's interesting to note that museums do continue to acquire. We continue to buy works of art and to build our collection. And one thing I want you to notice when you go in the exhibition is below there's this whole network of tree roots underneath it. So again, this notion of the life force coming through. Now in Sweden, there very much was a place-based type of symbolism, which was called national romanticism. In Germany, it was new romanticism. In Sweden, it was national romanticism. And here we see this particular artist with a lake in Värmland, which is in Sweden, on the right. And then we see it's like his specialty was really showing these glistening, very abstract elements of water. And we see this woman seen from behind, again, looking out at this very strange landscape. And this is a Finnish artist whose name is Eero Jarnefelt. And what he did is he usually depicted images in and around Finland. So again, there's this very much place-based pride in their national environment. And one of his favorite subjects was the national park of Colli, if anyone's ever been there. And you often see these trees. This is actually from a private collection, the one on the left that lent it to us. But here you see these trees again. It's very, and this is the same area in Colli. So now that we've seen how symbolism manifested itself in different countries, I want to conclude with just a sense of how they became intertwined, how this came to be something that we know as symbolism, how they related to one another. And these are 2 self-portraits by Edvard Munch. Again, this is the artist that did The Scream. He was Norwegian, but as I mentioned, The Scream is inscribed in German. These 2 prints were made in Germany. Munch had no market in his hometown. No one wanted to buy his art. So he came to Berlin. In 1892, he had his first exhibition at this artist space in Berlin, and it was closed by the police within 7 days. So, and also he didn't sell anything. So instead of going home with his head between, his head between his knees saying, oh, I failed, he thought, you know what? Scandal sells. And he toured that exhibition to a number of different cities throughout Germany and charged admission fees. So he didn't sell any works of art, but he made a lot of money. And he was very crafty, and he wrote to his mother about it. Another way that these artists became known to one another is through publications written about them. And this is the very first book ever written about Munch, called The Work of Edvard Munch, was published in 1894 in Berlin. And it was edited by this man, Stanislav Szyszewski, which I want you all to say 10 times really quickly. But he was a very unusual but very well-known Polish author and playwright. And here we see one of these works in the exhibition. This is Szyszewski himself. This is Szyszewski. And here, this is called Jealousy. We see this woman's hair is kind of connected to the man. Hair ends up being a very important symbolic element to Munch. And then man's head in woman's hair is, again, the woman is sort of entrapping him in her hair. So Szyszewski published these books and had organized exhibitions with other colleagues. And this print on the left, which is really just a beautiful hand-colored impression of the Madonna, it was initially called Woman Making Love. So the idea is the viewer is the male who is making love to the woman, and it's the moment of conception because there's sperm floating all around the image here, and there's this very strange-looking fetus looking at his mother on the lower part. But our friend Szyszewski said, no, let's not call it that. Let's call it the Madonna, which makes it even more sort of scandalous. Here you have the Madonna with the sort of halo here. So again, it's important to think that art critics really had a connection here. And I thought I wouldn't have enough to say, but I'm talking too much, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So if we get back to Redon, as I mentioned, Redon had a really hard time making a market for himself. So what he did is he went to Brussels. He went to that exhibition that we mentioned called Les Vins. And he sold this work on the left and the one in the middle at Les Vins. And that's how he found his market in Brussels, in Belgium. And he had a hard time finding a market in his own hometown until quite a bit later in his life. Now, Jane's Ensor, who we saw this work early on, self-portrait, with Devils Tormenting Me. This is actually a poster he made for an exhibition called the Salon des 100, the Salon of the 100. And he wanted to break through. He had a very good market in Brussels, but he wanted to break through in Paris. And so this is a poster he made for that exhibition. And this is the catalog for it. And it didn't work. He didn't sell anything. But part and parcel of that was this exhibition society, the Salon des 100, also published a journal to go along with it, with all of Ensor's works in it. So in case we think that modern society knows it all about marketing and promotion, they were doing it all in the 1890s and around the turn of the century. So really, all of these artists that we talked about today, despite their different styles, countries of origin, subject matter, they were joined through this growing dealer, journal, and exhibition network throughout Europe. And with that, I will end and encourage you to go see Strange Realities, The Symbolist Imagination. Thank you.